Hi, and welcome back. What I've got here is a very short uh, slideshow. I think it's 7 or 8 slides with just some key terms that you need to know about types of species. I don't know if there'd be a whole question about these terms, but they may show up as part of a bigger question. So here you go. Types of species. So certain types of species play a particular ecological role in their community, just meaning some species have maybe a more important role than other species, or maybe you'll see here it's a native species, meaning it evolved in that area, and that's important when you compare it to a non-native species. So really, to me, these are just like key terms that you need to know about the niche of certain types of species. All right. So first, a keystone species. And this was when we did spend some time discussing, we watched a video that I will link in the playlist, but we watched a video about the starfish and the tide pools. If you remember, they talked about keystone species. So keystone species, think key, right? Its role in the ecosystem, the things it does, maybe it digs tunnels or like beavers build dams. They do something or things in the ecosystem that make them really important to the other species and the functioning of that ecosystem. And without them, things kind of fall apart. So if you remember in the video we watched, when the scientists removed the starfish from the tide pool, it had this trickle down or domino effect that led to really a complete change in the ecosystem, where over time, all he found were urchins instead of a very diverse tide pool ecosystem. It had an effect on everything below it. So it's one of those species where if it's removed, everything seems to collapse. It has a bigger role than you might think. An indicator species. This is a species that usually has a very narrow range of tolerance. It likes conditions in a particular range. Often I think they're specialists. They just are very particular in their needs. And if something changes in the ecosystem, they change or their numbers decline, and it indicates that something is changing, has changed. So they often serve as early warnings of damage. So an example are trout, particularly like steelhead trout or the salmon that we raised in the classroom. The salmon that we raised in the classroom, if you remember, the tank was very cool. Those salmon, they have a very narrow range of tolerance. They like it pretty cool. I kept the tank around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I think it was 10 degrees Celsius. It was very cool. If the chiller went out, they would die. It's happened to other teachers. So they are very sensitive to change in temperature. They also need high levels of oxygen. So they serve as indicators because if a river warms up even slightly, certain kinds of trout like steelhead trout and salmon would move out or die off. And that would indicate to an ecologist that, wow, something has changed in this environment. So they indicate something's changed because they're so particular in their needs. If it's just a little bit off, they're going to die or move out. So here's an example that certain kinds of trout and salmon are very particular. The other two are native and non-native species. And this comes into play when you talk about introduced species or non-native species and how they disrupt ecosystems. So it's important to say, well, these ones are native. These ones normally live and thrive in this community. They evolved in this community. Sometimes they're what's called endemic. They were here from the start and they evolved these relationships in the community. A non-native would be those things that migrate, maybe deliberately or sometimes accidentally humans introduce things. They're sometimes called invasive or introduced species. So Norwegian roof rats, you may have seen these before. They are in Fresno. Norwegian roof rats did not evolve in the United States. Thus they're called Norwegian, right? They evolved in Norway and Europe. They think that they got onto ships and then hopped out all around the world. So they are non-native or introduced, and they have caused a lot of species extinction. They often will go after birds and other prey, and those prey have no defense because they didn't evolve with the roof rat. So I think that's why they scientists like to be sure you know the difference, native versus non-native, because the non-natives can cause trouble when they are introduced. So there you go, some pictures we got. On the left, our Norwegian roof rat, and on the right, the adorable San Joaquin kit fox that evolved here in the valley.